Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tear down a myth about a name you probably think you know, the Luddites. You know, when we call someone a Luddite, we mean they're afraid of technology, right? Well, what if I told you that whole idea gets their story completely, and I mean completely wrong?
So let's start at the top. Who was their mysterious leader, General Ludd? Well, the legend traces back to a kid who, maybe, supposedly, smashed a couple of machines in a rage way back in 1779. But fast forward 30 years, and that kid is somehow morphed into this mythical general, leading a ghost army that stalked the industrial towns of England. The story we're all told is that General Ludd and his followers were just simple-minded fanatics, smashing machines because they were terrified of the future. But the real story, which has been buried for 200 years, is so much more interesting, so much more complicated, and honestly, pretty surprising. To really get the Luddites, you first have to understand the world they were fighting to protect. And it was a world built on something we've kind of lost touch with, this incredible, tangible, human skill. You see, the Luddites weren't just laborers. They were masters of what historians call embodied knowledge. Now, this isn't something you can just look up in a manual or watch a tutorial for. It's a kind of wisdom that lives deep inside your body, in your hands, your muscles, your instincts. It's an understanding of a craft that you can only get through years and years of practice and feeling. Let's just take one of them, the master copper. His job was to shear the surface of woven wool. He didn't use a ruler. He felt the grain of the cloth with his fingertips. He could swing these massive 40-pound hand shears with the precision of a surgeon, knowing just by instinct the perfect pressure to apply. It was a physical, intuitive knowledge that, honestly, a machine just couldn't have. And this, right here, is the absolute key to their whole story. The Luddites were not anti-machine. They were fighting against how the machines were being used to churn out garbage, to deceive customers, and to destroy their entire way of life. So you gotta get that image of some terrified peasant out of your head. These were highly skilled artisans, weavers, knitters, croppers. They probably understood the technology of their day better than the factory owners who were just buying the machines. They had spent their entire lives working with and mastering complex equipment. Nothing shows their complaint better than what was happening with stockings. A skilled knitter made what were called fully fashioned stockings, a quality garment literally knitted to the shape of a human leg. It was built to last. But new, wider machines were being used to make cut-ups. They'd just knit a big, flat sheet of fabric, cut out a rough shape, and sew it up the back. These things were garbage. They'd fall apart the first time you wore them. The Luddites were fighting against this fraud, this replacement of real craftsmanship with cheap, shoddy goods made by unskilled kids. So what do? How do you fight back? Well, it wasn't with just blind rage. It was with a highly organized, disciplined, and very symbolic resistance. You see, their raids were like a form of collective bargaining by sledgehammer. They would only target the workshops of owners who were paying starvation wages or cranking out those inferior, cut-up goods. If a factory owner paid a fair wage and maintained quality, his machines were left completely untouched. This wasn't chaos. This was targeted justice. And that sledgehammer, the very symbol of their movement, became a legend in its own right. It wasn't just any old hammer. It had a name. They called it the Great Enoch. Okay, but why that name? The answer to this question reveals just how clever, how ironic, and how deeply aware these workers were of the new world being built around them. Get this. The story is just incredible. The new shearing frames that were putting the croppers out of a job were being forged by a company named Enoch Taylor & Sons. And where do you think the Luddites got their massive sledgehammers from? Yep, the exact same company. The tool that was displacing them and the tool of their resistance were literally born in the very same fire. This became their slogan, their rallying cry. Enoch made them, and Enoch shall break them. It's just a perfect, poetic summary of their entire struggle, turning the power of the new industrial age back on itself. Well, as you can imagine, the factory owners and the government didn't really appreciate the poetry of the situation. Their response was anything but subtle. It was swift, and it was absolutely brutal. The British government sent more than 12,000 soldiers to occupy the industrial districts where the Luddites were active. I mean, let that number sink in. This wasn't a police action. This was a full-on military occupation of their own country. And just to put that in perspective for you, at the time, this was a larger army than the Duke of Wellington had fighting Napoleon in Spain and Portugal. Think about that. The British government saw its own skilled workers as a bigger threat than the entire French Empire.
Then, Parliament made breaking a machine a capital crime, punishable by death. The famous poet Lord Byron, in his very first speech in the House of Lords, stood up and argued passionately against it. He asked his colleagues if the price of a machine was really more valuable than a human life. He was one of the very few powerful people who actually got it. But the law passed, and in the trials that followed, 17 Luddite leaders were hanged. Dozens more were shipped off to Australia, never to see their homes again. The movement was systematically and utterly crushed. So, yeah, the Luddites lost. They were defeated. But what was the real tragedy here? It's a question that, frankly, echoes powerfully into our own age of massive technological disruption.
And this is the part that's really haunting. The factory-made cloth, the cut-up stockings, they still looked basically the same. The product was still there. But that human knowledge, that embodied skill that used to live inside the fabric, was gone. And because you couldn't see the loss on the surface, most of society just didn't notice. Or maybe they didn't care.
Here's the dilemma they leave us with, the really tricky part. The Luddites were right about what was being lost, this deep, profound human skill. But the factory owners were also right about what would be gained: cheaper goods for more people, efficiency, and the birth of the modern world. Both sides were right. And that brings us right back to today, 200 years after the great Enoch swung for the last time. As AI and automation are reshaping our world, displacing all new kinds of skills, the Luddite question is more relevant than it has ever been. What invisible knowledge are we okay with losing today? And will we even notice it's gone?